Hello, everyone. This is Jonathan Little, and I'm back today with the sixth episode of Weekly Poker Hand. Today, I'm going to be reviewing a hand I played in a World Poker Tour event recently. This was a pretty fun hand where I make what ended up being a very nice value bet. So, let's check it out. Let's see if I actually was making that value bet. Alright, so we have a limp to 400 at 200, 400 from middle position. Notice that all the stacks, well, the limper has 60 big blinds. I have a lot of chips. This player who's going to come into the hand from the big blind has 3,500 chips, or 35,000 chips, so he has about 90 big blinds. So facing a limp from early position with pocket fours on the button, I'm fine with limping. I'm fine with raising. I don't really care. I think you should probably mix it up whenever you're very deep stacked. I do elect to raise to 1,500. Then, to my surprise, you don't see this happen too often, the player in the big blind re-raised to 3,600. So I made it 1,500, he made it 3,600. And again, we are playing about 90 big blinds deep. The player who limped folded, of course, because he had garbage. And now it's back to me. So getting amazing pot odds in position with pocket fours, I'm fairly prone to call and see a flop. I have to put in 2,000 more to perhaps win up to 31,000 for my opponent's stack plus the pot, which is going to be about 6 or 5,000 at the moment. So I'm perfectly fine with calling and seeing a flop. I don't really think there's any other good option, and I'm mostly set mining. The flop comes queen, 8, 5, 2 spades. I have a spade, but that's not particularly relevant. My opponent bets 2,600 into the 8,500 chip pot. And at this point, I'm certainly not loving my hand or my situation, but I think I can realistically call and have my opponent play in a somewhat straightforward manner on the turn in the river. I think my plan in this scenario is to call. If I peel a set, that's great. If I don't peel a set, of course I'm not calling purely to peel a set. That should be very clear. Whenever you're 20 to 1 to hit your hand, you probably shouldn't be drawing to it. I think that if a spade comes, I can realistically bluff my opponent off of something like pocket jacks, 10s, 9s, etc. If he has ace-king, my opponent may just check fold the turn. A lot of players will make these weak continuation bets with their garbage and make big continuation bets with their good hands because they want to save money. So there is a possibility of me being able to bluff my opponent off of, not necessarily bluff him off of, but at least win the hand when my opponent has ace-king. So I don't mind floating. This is pretty much a pure float. A float is whenever you call the flop with the intention of stealing the pot on the turn. I don't think I'm going to be able to steal it every time by any means, but I think if my opponent checks the turn, I'm going to have a pretty good opportunity to win this hand. So I'm going to call this 2,600 and we will proceed. I think raising is also an option as a semi-bluff slash bluff. It's not really a semi-bluff. It's more of a just raising to try to steal the pot. And also so I don't face a turn bet. Anyways, on the turn's a queen, which is actually a really good card for me, because if I had top pair on the flop, I would have certainly called. It's a very good card for my range. Not necessarily for my hand. It's actually a relatively blank card for my hand. But at this point, I'm not really playing my hand for its value. I'm more so turning my hand into a bluff. I'm trying to make my opponent fold every hand that is worse than perhaps pocket jacks at the moment, or pocket 10s at the moment. And I think there could be some of those. I don't think there's a ton, but I don't mind if my opponent folds ace-king. I certainly don't mind if he folds pocket 9s or pocket 7s or 6s. I don't know if he would have re-raised those pre-flop. Of course, he's never folding a queen. But the thing is that I'm not exactly trying to make him fold out everything on the turn. The goal is to bet the turn and then jam the river. I'm going to shove all in on the river if my opponent check calls the turn with the intention of making him fold everything worse than a queen. That is definitely what I'm going for in this scenario. I'm trying to get him to call the turn bet. I bet 7,000 into the 13,000 pot, by the way, when my opponent checks. So I'm not trying to gain a ton of fold equity on the turn with my bet, but I'm setting this hand up such that I think I'll have a lot of fold equity on the river when I bet 22,000 or whatever my opponent will have left. So if my opponent folds a turn, that's great. If he calls a turn, I am almost certainly going to fire the river. This is a fantastic spot to go for it. If the river was a spade completing the flush, I would have been also very happy to shove. I would certainly not have a problem with that. But like I said, I'm already going to shove pretty much any river to try to get my opponent off of every hand worse than a queen. So the river's a two of hearts, total brick. I guess it puts up a backdoor flush, but whenever the backdoor flush comes in, you usually don't need to be too concerned with that. It's very hard for me to have hearts or for him to have hearts at this point. I mean, sometimes your opponent will, sometimes you will, but it's just not a real gigantic factor. So my opponent checks. Like I said, I don't really see any other play besides shoving all in. If I can make my opponent fold, for sure, jacks or worse, I think I'm pretty happy shoving. I think if my opponent has aces, he will probably still find a hero call. But my opponent's hand does not look like aces. A lot of people would bet larger on the flop with aces, or they would just continue betting the turn with aces. So I definitely like shoving. I think shoving is by far the best play. So I shove, and my opponent calls, and oh, then I win. So apparently, my idea to bluff this particular player was atrocious because he called with what turned out to be ace high. He told me he had ace king the next day. I actually played with him, and this was a re-entry tournament. I played with him again the next day, and he said that he had ace king, and he put me on a flush draw. This is something that you should definitely not do when you're playing poker. You do not want to put your opponent on a particular hand or a particular type of hand. I mean, what did I do throughout this hand that made him think I could only have a flush draw? Why could I not have a queen, right? I mean, I think a queen makes up a ton of my range. I would certainly raise a limper with a lot of queens. I would certainly call a small 3-bet. I would call a weak flop bet. I would bet the turn when check to, and I would shove the river. So this is exactly the same way I would play a queen. How would I play a busted flush draw? Maybe the same way. I would have played that the same way as well. But the thing is that you can't put me on exactly a queen or exactly a flush draw. You have to put me on the nuts and a flush draw. And interestingly enough, if I'm going to be turning all of my small pairs into bluffs, because if I had pocket 7s, 6s, maybe even 9s, I probably would have turned those into a bluff as well to try to get my opponent off of a few better hands. So if I'm turning made hands into bluffs, then my opponent really needs to fold ace king. He was actually flabbergasted to see pocket 4s, and he stormed off pretty quick. But it's an interesting spot where my opponent made I'll call it a classic error. It's pretty much a fundamental error that the vast majority of amateur poker players make, of putting me on a hand and not a range of hands. If he put me on a range of a queen and a flush draw and a few sporadic made hands turned into bluffs, I think my opponent would have at least found a fold, or at least had the opportunity to find a fold. But if he thinks I have only flush draws and all of the flush draws miss, besides the flush draw with a 5 and the flush draw with a 2, by the way, if I had like ace 2 of spades or something like that, or ace 5 of spades, or 6 5 of spades, I would have played those in the same manner as this as well. But if he thinks I have exactly a busted flush draw, of course he has to call with ace king, but that's not my range, and my opponent really screwed up by playing the hand in that manner. If you guys like these weekly poker hand videos and the analysis, I definitely suggest you check out my other products. You can find those on jonathanlittlepoker.com. At the top of the page there is a products tab. You can get my books, my webinars, my training videos, and stuff like that from there. So it seems like you guys are liking these weekly poker hand videos. If you guys have any suggestions, comments, or anything like that to make them better, I'm more than happy to implement them. I'm trying my best to make a site that you guys love and enjoy. So let me know what you want, and I will do my best to make it. Thank you very much for watching. This has been Jonathan Little for Weekly Poker Hand.